I'm really excited and pleased to welcome everyone into the session today, and especially a warm welcome and a thank you to our two guest panelists. So I'll introduce them each in turn, and then they'll have a chance to give you an introduction to their work, and then we'll just dive right into lots and lots of questions, hopefully. So I hope everyone's come prepared with some things to ask. So first, it's a real pleasure to introduce Akshat Rathi, who is a reporter for Bloomberg News and is based in London. He has a PhD in organic chemistry and a BTech in chemical engineering. And Akshat tells stories of the people tackling the biggest problems facing humanity, obviously climate change. He has edited a book of essays from young climate leaders and is currently working on a book about scaling up climate solutions. Previously, Akshat was a senior reporter at Quartz, a science editor at The Conversation, and he has also worked at The Economist and the Royal Society of Chemistry. His writings have been published in Nature, The Hindu, The Guardian, Ars Technica, and Chemistry World, among others. And Akshat has been nominated for many journalism awards, and in 2018, he won Journalist of the Year at the Drums Online Media Awards ceremony. What a privilege it is to have him here with us. Thank you, Akshat, for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And it's also a pleasure to welcome Aruna Chandrasekhar. Aruna is an independent journalist and writer from India, currently working at the University of Oxford, but currently in India at this moment. Her interests and work dwell on the themes of corporate accountability, climate change, indigenous rights and resistance, environmental law, energy, conflict, gender, and public health. Her stories have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Internationalist, BuzzFeed, and many other outlets across broadcast, print, and online. She likes to tell difficult stories differently and as a way of grappling with questions around global development choices, energy transitions, and the future of frontline communities at risk in our fast-warming world. These are the questions that have led her on a journey from central India's coalfields to the Conference of Parties on Climate Change. Again, it's a great privilege to have her here. Thank you, Aruna, and thank you, Akshat.
Thanks so much, Liam. And just to let everyone know, unfortunately, like you, I was a master's student at the University of Oxford. And now I work with Amnesty and advise them on climate 3 days a week. And I continue to write stories. I'm working on a book right now to follow in Akshat's illustrious footsteps. And you should all read his books. And especially United, which is a particularly powerful one. I wrote a review for it, and happy to share. Really great to be here today.
Great stuff. Thanks, Aruna. So, well, why don't we go to you first, Aruna, if you want to take five to 10 minutes to introduce more of your work and kind of get us warmed up for some question and answers in the panel. So let's go to Aruna first.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to briefly try and share a screen and be slightly boomer-like while trying to do that. So please bear with me. I think just a few photos for context might sort of help. And here we go. Yeah, I think, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, from ground zero to net zero. Right now you see me in this role and so on, but how I sort of stumbled into environmental journalism, to be quite frank, I studied mass media in Bombay, and through really, like most millennials now, ended up where we are, thanks to social media. And I was glancing through, that's what we're going to call it, a friend's album of photographs from civil war that's decades long, Eastern and Central India, where mineral-based conflicts have been ongoing. And at that point was when, and this was sort of a picture and from an album called From the Heart of the Country in the Middle of Nowhere, had an older brother who's also a journalist. But looking at these pictures was did make me realize that a lot of these conflicts, it was called Operation Green Hunt, where indigenous communities were being labeled as anti-nationals, anti-state, and being arrested. But this area was has a overlap of both India's forest cover as well as mineral cover. And I lived, my parents' home is not too far from there. So it sort of led me on a journey of trying to understand. And at that time, I was working in entertainment, I was working in digital content and India's mobile revolution at that point, and trying to push out Bollywood videos to millions of subscribers and trying to drive up revenue. But on the other hand, these were stories that were reaching me that were actually close to home. And everyone has that moment. I'm sure the fact that you're on this course would have been some moment that sparked that off. And I decided that as a woman of medium privilege, with access to also knowing or trying to do research and tell stories, that I wanted to understand what my own footprint was in terms of where am I getting my water from, where do I get my energy from, and well, these places are actually close to home. So who were these communities, who bears the footprint of our extraction? And that sort of set me on this journey to kind of look at, essentially, it started with mineral conflicts. So this was me at the start of it all, a very young, aspirational Arundhati Roy looking person. But this was one of the first assignments that I tried to work on, where I went in looking at a place which is known for community conservation of birds, migratory birds, except there was a huge thermal power plant being set up there. And the day I arrived was when the plant machinery had just been pushed in and installed, and 3 people were killed in police firings and huts were burned down. So as the image on the right is a hut that was burned down, along with, again, with switches and so on, and like sort of stayed emblazoned in my mind. So after you see something like that, is essentially no going back, and knowing and learning slowly of the kinds of costs of power and of energy, and looking at essentially that cost is unequally and disproportionately borne by communities of color, but especially by indigenous communities and Dalit communities. So for me, at least in terms of climate coverage, that has always been a sort of, so yeah, I would go and put my GPS in my bag and try and map the kinds of areas and lands and try and pitch these stories. But these stories were rejected a couple of times in a row. But then I realized, okay, why not sort of use this as an opportunity to lend my communications media skills to organizations and research skills to organizations that were working with communities affected by mining, affected by climate change. So that sort of led, so as you can see on the woman on the left, there actually is no signal. There is no, now that's something that's drastically changed. We get reports coming out of places where frontline communities are hit. So this was another part of the early days of reporting on these issues, which is a mine in central Orissa, which is on the eastern coast of India, operated by a British mining firm named Vedanta. And for the first time around then was when communities rejected mining on their lands, saying that they had the right to free, prior, informed consent. You can see these large piles of red mud from alumina refining and so on. So I think my journey, or at least I've been also documenting and writing about these sorts of conflicts. And and from there I moved on, especially when working with Amnesty in India. I mean, I'm now the late millennial part of the journalist movement, but essentially that I spent the next 6 years traveling around India's largest coal mines and documenting both violations, whether it's incredible amounts of pollution, more likely in terms of land and displacement, which is done without people's consent. Now, sometimes these narratives are always, for me, that has always been, at least in terms of the challenges of course, linking extraction on the domestic front and displacement and equity issues, and to the wider climate debacle. Now, of course, there are issues in terms of looking at developing countries versus developed countries. And this is often a fight that plays out in climate negotiations. But I think my work has always been sort of led by the work in these years of seeing those who suffer disproportionately. And it's often justified in terms of course, electricity and growth. But I would see villages right on these edges that didn't have electricity connections, where water was cut off to push people to move. One of the good things about working with an organization is that they did help allow me to work on this for a long enough period of time to get the sort of grounding to see what those local impacts are. And that's not something you necessarily get with every media publication and so on. So I quit. And so yeah, I mean, some of these mines, you could fit the entire of central Delhi into the mine in the previous picture. So yeah, so it's so since then it was also trying to how do you kind of convert these into like stories that are compelling and to an audience that might necessarily, whether it's on a national level saying, no, we need electricity, we need growth, we need development. How do you care for people on ground? So trying to use different mediums to tell the story, whether it is breaking it down into animation videos on how to mine coal in 20 easy ways. So we actually used VR to kind of film this. And it was one of the first films that was acquired by the UN to sort of demonstrate and show all sides of the picture. So believe in experimenting with, different kinds of formats to tell these difficult stories. So yeah, and from there, from looking at coal, and again, like some of these were insane projects. So one of the stories that I'd worked on is that now increasingly, rather from looking at a national perspective, looking into national perspective. So one of the stories that I worked on was on the Adani coal mining project, or a coal project that essentially the craziest coal plant I've ever heard of, where coal is sourced from Australia, brought to India, burnt in India, and power exported to Bangladesh. So I think the importance of building those sorts of connections. So yeah, I think one of the things is moving from there to sort of covering climate impacts and like essentially like looking at floods and damages, and then getting to a point where, of course, I wanted to look at more in terms of how this is financed, where again, who bears the responsibility. So I've been trying various different mediums to sort of do this. Some places opinion pieces work better, some places looking at detailed and in-depth investigations. But I think through the course of it all, some things that I've at least tried to do in my reportage is to center communities who are worst impacted, to bring out their intersectionality, and to look at it from that particular lens, and instead of purely from an emissions front, which sometimes can reduce what are incredibly complex stories that need to be told. But yeah, more about that and stuff that I work on. Please feel free to ask me any questions. Over to Akshat.
Thanks so much, Aruna. Just before you go, Akshat, I should have said at the beginning, if people do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat or start raising your hand after Akshat has finished, and we'll come to you individually as well. So if you've got questions coming through, feel free to type them in or hold them until Akshat's done. So yeah, over to you, Akshat. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. So I would say I've sort of come to journalism from, again, just like Aruna, slightly unusual route, which is never went to a school studying journalism. I used to write as a hobby, and at the end of my PhD, or middle of my PhD, actually, I decided I didn't want to stay in academia and turned to writing. And as you would do, I thought, what's the best skill set I can bring to journalism? And one thing that compelled me to write was that there was a gap in the public understanding of science and scientific issues. And it also was my training. And so it felt like if I could try and find a job in journalism through that skill set, then that might be my route into finding a new career. And that worked out quite well. Sometime around 2015, 2016, after the Paris Climate Agreement, is when I started looking at climate as a core issue of my reporting. And The main reason for that was really because it was a time when finally there were solutions being adopted, or at least countries were ready to do something about it, even if it's in a a slightly more aggressive way than previously. But how do you go about changing essentially the physical economy was is a complicated problem, and very few people, even at the highest levels of governance in companies or governments, really have an idea how to do it. And so most of my journalism around climate change has been to try and focus on the solutions. What are the ways in which we can change the economy so that we can cut emissions, but also, uplift populations around the world, because if we don't tackle both the problems, we won't solve either of the problems. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and very happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Akshat. And I was just reflecting on how valuable those different perspectives are, especially I think from next week. We in our course we start to look at how the question of development and the history of development and the history of kind of the economics of the system that we're in interact with climate change. So this is a really good primer for some of those conversations that will come up from next week onwards. I'm just going to kick off with like a really just one or two very short and quick questions, and then obviously hopefully we'll build up a bank of questions coming from the fellows. Aruna, you kind of touched on this before, but I was wanting to ask you how often you both come across powerful or really important stories that you want to publish, but for whatever reason you feel like you can't because I don't know, your editor isn't interested in it, or there isn't a space that's trying to talk about that issue that you feel is important to get out there. How often does that come up, and what do you kind of, how do you resolve that challenge? Let's go to Akshat first and then Aruna afterwards.
Fortunately, I've not had that problem. I would say I've had problems trying to report on stories I would like to tell, but either because I've not been able to access the place in which, say, mining is happening, or where there's a disaster that we'd like to write about, and it's private property or it's marked so, and we can't get access. But I've not had a problem in trying to tell. If I have a story and I am able to report about it, and even if I don't have access to the location, as long as I can speak to the people who can inform those stories, I've never had a problem with editors. I mean, and it's not like we've, through just this year, for example, I've written stories that have been critical of Saudi Aramco, which is an oil company. In December, we had a series on ExxonMobil, which is another oil company. There was a critical story about Bill Gates, who said he's divesting from fossil fuels, but hadn't. I wrote a story about Mark Carney, who's a central banker from England, who's seen as a very green finance voice in the world. But, again, he got basic definitions wrong. I wrote a story about Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, which is the largest asset management firm, who mixed up carbon dioxide with greenhouse gases. And so you can see that he hadn't given the topic much thought. And I wrote a story about that. And so the point of telling these stories has always been that you find the problem, but you also try and explain not just somebody making a problem, but what impact does that have on the wider world? And, what is the reason in the first place that some person or some entity has made that mistake or has got themselves into trouble?
Right. So Akshat has been lucky to work with some amazing editors and also others who have his back. And which has often, I've also been lucky to work with publications who are willing to be on board with that. At the same time, if I am being honest, I quit to be working at a nonprofit where now again I consult with others. But I quit to be an independent journalist, largely from a point of also looking at Indian media and also the spaces for telling these stories full time. Now, if you look at, and I think there's also Reuters Institute of Journalism analysis, which looks at how many mainstream papers have full time climate correspondents. Now, one of the things which is quite apparent is the fact that, again, the countries that are, again, responsible for a great deal of emissions seem to have more climate reporters. And quite a lot of publications that tend to have them as full time. So you have somebody who's tracking negotiations, you have someone who's tracking impacts and traveling to places on ground in different parts of the world. And you have people who are covering it from a local beat perspective and or from an industry perspective. Here, I would look at colleagues who were one day doing a corruption story on something completely different in the finance ministry, then covering elections, then doing environment, and if they're lucky, and being asked to do entertainment. So the idea of specialist beats, and of course, environmental journalists, there are some extremely great peers of mine and who've also managed to stick around, but very often a lot of them have been let go of, and a lot of them are freelancers at this stage, because again, even certain big publications would say things like, okay, right, you can do the story, but you can't name names, which is, what is the point if you're not going to interrogate authority? So, I mean, right from the outset, and there's also been the other phenomena where regional bureaus have been shut down. So you would have, even if you're looking at the business papers, you have journalists who are covering the mining sector have those positions have been sort of have no longer exist. So there is like, even like of the business papers where it would be important to do of, well, how did this public hearing for the establishment of a new, coal power plant, how did that go? And even investors might be interested in hearing like that. So that coverage has also trickled off. So I think, so for me, that strategy was to always be independent, but also make use of the fact that I did have privilege. So, I mean, there was, my mom used to call it like, again, like journalism of courage, her own fellowship that she would offer me to say that, okay, by the time your freelancers checks, we don't know when they might come in, we don't know how much they might be. But okay, here is enough to sort of sustain. So yeah, I mean, some part of it were like, these were the stories that I wanted to chase, irrespective of which publication would take them. So it's that constant thing of keeping on pitching until someone is interested in it, especially where climate is a nascent field. So, and then also having to deal with rejections. So it takes thick skin, it takes also a degree of risk, and not many places also cover travel. So a lot of that has been also putting in your own money to go and do the research or to go and investigate, and then pitching to a bunch of publications whether they're interested. So yeah.
Great, thank you both. I'm just going to go straight to Aman's question, because it's kind of similar, and maybe this is more for Aruna than Akshat. But Aman talks about political threats and the threat of physical violence to reporters who challenge some of the corporations or the status quo. Obviously, that's a threat in certain parts of the world more so than others. But Aman asks, how do you handle it? Like, how do you not let it stop you doing what you're doing, I guess?
In that sense, I would say that, I mean, yeah, that depends on you, on not letting it stop you doing what you're doing, and pitching to places where you know that you have an editor who has your back, and you have a legal team who will, of course, and doing just the really important straight and narrow editing to make sure, like a lot of places you might publish and then get into soup for, again, things which could have been fixed. So I think it's that being able to have that trusting relationship with editors, of course, and the fact that that they will stick their own necks out to ensure that these stories are covered. There are a handful of places, sorry about the noise, but yeah, there are a handful of places where that might pick up on some of these stories. And we do know that many outlets have declined to publish or don't do enough or hold back. So I mean, on ground, perhaps for me, like there will be those threats of being followed. There have been occasions where that has happened, where of course then you are afraid of the kinds of notices and other things that come to you. But yeah, I mean, there, if the work is its motivation, and being able to report, speak to all sides of the story, be thorough in your investigations, and have editors who support this kind of work and give you the time that you need to get your facts straight. That's really important.
Thanks, Aruna.
Also, sorry, forgot to mention that again. Like, there's a thing of like again, we are at whether we're reporting global publications or there is a degree of immunity there. If you're a big city parachuting journalist who shows up in the village and says, "I have like a bunch of questions," you leave. The repercussions are on the people that you talk to. And on the local journalists who show you around. And these are, of course, not only jobs that have been axed. Like one guy in a coal town said that I've become an insurance investigator because at least here I get to investigate. In journalism, that's no longer the case, or that my outlet gets ads from the same companies. So like, they face far more threats, and there are on the daily stories of journalists getting attacked by sand mining mafia or by the coal mafia and so on. So the threats to them and the risks to them are a lot more. So it's essentially like, I think this of you parachuting in and having a degree of safety around you is one thing. How do you ensure that for those who you collaborate with and who show you those leads, and also make sure that this is something that's sustainable for them? And yeah, that's where the real, especially the threats and challenges also lie.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Thanks, Aruna. So I'm going to ask another question from the chat, and then I'll come to Arjun afterwards, who's got his hand up. So we'll be with you soon, Arjun. A couple of people have asked about how you can write about what can often be scientific and technical and very kind of specific language, but also in a way that is a kind of approachable to the layperson. So Mario asks about finding a balance between that technical language and more understandable mainstream language, and what do you feel works best in order to connect to different audiences? And I think there was another person asking a similar question. Greg was asking, how can you make science, especially on climate change, compelling and interesting, and how do you get that story, how do you tell the story in a way that's engaging? So let's go to Akshat first.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and it's a challenge. It really is. You know, one thing that I know is the more you do, the better you get, and the better you get at doing it if you seek feedback. So as I said, I'm not trained in journalism, so all my training has come from being on the job. And one thing I learned very early on through people who've been journalists is when you write a story, when your editor sends it back, you see why the edits were made. And if you don't understand them, ask for the reasons for why the edits were made. And then you learn that way. I will say that from a perspective of making something interesting, it also helps to read very, very broadly. So if you can read a lot, you will understand and you will develop your own taste for what is a good storytelling technique, or what is a good way of explaining a complex topic. And you know, all artists are building on top of other artists, and so to some extent journalists are fact finders, but to another extent we are also artists, because we are being creative in how we use those facts to tell a story, you know, without making anything up. And so if you read more widely, you'll get an understanding of what is it that interests you. And the final thing, which is one about just a low threshold for I mean, bullshit, but also generally I get bored very quickly. And that is actually an advantage. If I am not, and especially in my own writing, if I'm getting bored of my own writing, I'm doing something wrong. But it is also a good, I don't know if it's a skill, but you can certainly develop a refinement on what is a good story. So if some story bores me, I leave it. And that's another good feedback.
Yeah. On the subject of boring, my older brother also was like, "Why did you pick the most boring beat that exists?" No, it's sometimes writing about the environment, writing about climate, writing about emissions are extremely, of course, science heavy, and how do you break it down is often the question. A dear friend of mine used to keep referring to my pieces as MTPA, which is million tons per annum, kind of pieces, my earlier work, and essentially saying that, okay, you get into a lot of the technicalities of illegalities of things. I think there's also been a transition for me when you're trying to report quite rigorously. And I think there's this greater tradition to try and like constantly have to prove and make sure that all your facts are there, of course. Is essential, but there's also the risk that you will end up losing readers. So I think that also comes with a certain confidence that you know what you're saying, you have enough to back you up, and get to a point where you're like, okay, right, okay, let me find a good way to tell this as a human story. And I find that it's really important to kind of to zoom out and think of it's always the mate at the pub test of any mate at your time meeting in the pub, and you just have to tell them what you're working on without boring them to death. That's often the best way to actually start writing, and to tell this to someone who, and especially if you're also speaking across languages, across global contexts sometimes, and writing for international publications has been good because that also makes you do that. But I mean, but there's also the flip side of it, where you can lose nuance, which a lot of national or local and otherwise read depends on who you're writing for, essentially. So that's sort of how you carve it into language as well. So make it adaptable to the publication and develop your voice, but also be aware of the fact that whoever you're writing for has a voice of their own. So how can you sort of match that? But more importantly, what I've also seen is that without human stories, without to take your narrative through, and those voices, people need a sort of arc there, and it helps to have that. So yeah, that's something that's really important. And for me also, I think there's this bit of around positionality, where even if you are telling the story, where you sort of course, one part of journalism allows you to do that, another part doesn't. So when you do have that leeway, explore where you are as a narrator. And if you are coming from a position of privilege or as an outsider, to sort of make that known instead of taking over other people's stories. But yeah, finding ways to translate the science into something that's interesting, that's part of the challenge. And it's like asking the smartest people in the room to, right, explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old, so I can further explain this to other people who might be a similar age and above. So yeah, that's the fun of the job, actually. So yeah. And like Akshat said, read a lot. I'm a really bad reader. I only read a lot of long form essays, but yeah, the reading more broadly, and whether it's poetry or scripts or whatever else, gives you much better writing chops.
Great, thank you both. Let's go to Arjun now, who's had his hand up patiently.
Thanks, Liam. No, I have two questions, and maybe you could split them between the two of you, depending on sort of who wants to take the first one. The first question, I don't know, I mean, it was very interesting to see sort of the experience that you've had with mining and with Vedanta, and especially I know there was, I mean, I was very involved around the time when sort of the protests were happening to say why is Australia sending their coal mines to us, and why is sort of Adani being allowed to open another coal mine. I think that was in Australia, if I'm not mistaken. So no, my question is basically, when you see things like this which happen at such scale, sort of when there's a certain amount of influence that's involved, and it really takes sort of journalists like yourselves to gather momentum and build sort of public opinion to bring things like these down. We've actually had like in the past week we had an interesting topic on sort of climate grief, and I want to know how you guys deal with it, because sometimes it seems like there's such big players that you wonder what is it that you really need to do, how far would you really need to go, and what is going to sort of tip the needle in terms of actually causing some sort of change. So that's my first question. The second question is to do with the actual communication itself. I find that a lot of climate communication sometimes can either be too preachy or too sort of guilt-inducing. You guys, what it is that you found is something that is a little bit more maybe less direct in a way that it resonates with the readers.
Akshat, do you want to take second one?
Yeah, I mean,
First one?
I can. So what tips the balance is a very good question. It's one that, I'm trying to tackle with my book when I'm looking at scaling solutions. And what we're going to need to try and solve this problem is essentially we've let reducing emissions for so long that pretty much every entity from the smallest to the biggest has to participate. And my goal in storytelling is when I find a problem, what is the biggest solution that I can try and solve with the problem I found, is something I ask myself. So I mean, one way to say it, so for example, let's take the Saudi Aramco story. It just helps me to anchor it to a story. So Saudi Aramco, world's largest oil company in Saudi Arabia, which doesn't really care that much about climate change, and probably as the only commodity that's going to keep its coffers running, will try and block and has tried and blocked progress for a very long time. What do you do to get Saudi Aramco to change, right? So that the story that we told was simply that Saudi Aramco, as now a publicly held company, is required to make a certain amount of disclosures. And we asked ourselves, is Saudi Aramco making the disclosures that are required of a public company? When we looked into the documents, we found out no, they aren't. About half their emissions aren't disclosed. And then we went to the company with those facts, and the company was accepted that yes, that's a problem, and that they're going to correct their disclosures. So that seems like a small change, but the fact that we could go to an oil company in Saudi Arabia and get them to accept that their environmental disclosure isn't right feels to me like a big step, right? After this, you build on the next story. When they make the full disclosures, then you can go and find out what the problem with those disclosures are. And so you start building your stories and your action. If you're outside journalism, you're trying to get people to change your minds. You start small, but you start building up to what eventually adds up. And yeah, that's the.
Yeah, and also taking off from what Akshat said, I think that where do you find and how do you speak to different audiences? I mean, but at the same time, you're dealing with, okay, for me, climate grief has been like if I'm on, the lights are on, then coal is being mined somewhere in India, someone is being displaced, someone I know, or in areas where I've gone and taken my SLR to, that there are communities who had no say on it. So that's something that I live with every day. I have my nightmares have bulldozers, and so those are regular features. But at the same time, I think some of my greatest sources of hope have been climate defenders who, in spite of the odds, now there might be days where even I might feel completely chicken to take something on, but who, in spite of all of the repression, whether it's legal threats, whether it's funding squeezes, who continue to work on these issues. The fact that there are movements springing up in different parts. Earlier, it used to be quite confined to certain areas where urban people would not have that connect. Now to get to a point where through whether it's the youth climate movement or otherwise, and impacts being lived and experienced. I'm in, I mean, a city which large parts of will possibly be seeing sea level rise by 2030. So knowing that places like home are already dealing with these issues. So the grief is there, but I think there's always resistance in that phase. And as long as that's something that's there, that's something that I draw connection from, a sense of community from, and that there are people working towards solutions, that there are people trying to really push the narrative and also towards the fact that things are possible. I might be seen as a bit of a Debbie Downer on Twitter, but at the same time, that hope is something that is radical, and also, telling those stories of what are those connections with nature, for instance, like, and making the connect between urban and rural. We've also done this we've done this series of stories called Breathless, which looks at air pollution across India from different places, from Bombay, Chennai, Bangalore, but looking at the different pollution sources and those who are frontline workers as well. So like Bangalore sanitation workers who are who breathe in heavy amounts of dust, who live next to industrial areas, or from China or from Chennai, where there's coal power plants, but fishing communities who are living in these wetlands, and they rescued people during the Chennai floods, and they're also fighting back against the coal power plants. So you have stories, and these are kabaddi and sports coaches, right? So saying that kids can't breathe. So you are both telling a story that is affecting, you are telling a story that there are wins, that there are people fighting, that there is that there is action being taken in that sense, but also that definitely that there's more that can be done, and cities or places would be wiser in protecting their last defenses. So yeah, there's that. So community, solidarity, humor, music, and culture, and trying to plug that into your climate storytelling as well. Yeah.
I think one thing to say is growing up in India, one lesson I always carry with me is, in India, everywhere you turn, there's a problem. And that was just the state of being growing up. But that never stopped us from doing things, moving forward. And so that's been my sort of mental health check in climate, because everywhere you look in climate, there are problems. But if you can try and tackle those problems as they come, or one by one, that keeps you going, because there are so many problems, there are many ways to solve it as well, and every solution is a win.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to try and put two questions together here as well from the chat. One from Angela, which is talking about, I mean, so Angela's talking from her perspective as a professional communications PR person, and asking how folks in her profession can help be most helpful to climate journalists, and in thinking about what's not going well at the moment, in terms of so greenwashing is one of the things that she puts out particularly. And Danya asked a similar question about how kind of corporates and industrialists are now talking a lot about climate change, a lot more than they were a few years ago, and maybe that's a good thing, but how much of that talk is being kind of represented on the ground, and how much of it is greenwashing? Do you have any feelings on that?
So I will be blunt. It's I found very few PR people are helpful, and that's probably not an indictment of the people themselves. I think they have a job that's very hard, and they have to pitch to a lot of journalists and a lot of publications, and they aren't always able to customize it, curate it, make it relevant to that particular journalist, because they want to also reach a vast audience. But the PR people who have been useful to me, and it's not the case that nobody has, there are a few who have, are people who read my stories, so who know what I work on, and then bring stories where either they fit in the kinds of stories I write, or they take the stories I have written one step forward. And that's a very hard thing to do. So that's what I'd say about PR. On corporate, absolutely right. I mean, greenwashing is rife, and if anything, it's only going to grow because now the world is setting net zero goals, and net zero goals means you're going to have to at least show that you're doing something about it, and most likely those steps will have problems. So the way I tackle it is I typically look at companies that have done it right, and there are a few companies pretty much in every space who have done something right. So let's take an example. Let's talk about carbon offsets, for example. Carbon offsets are typically seen as forestation programs around the world, and they are almost certainly not storing the carbon that they promise. So 99.9% of carbon offsets are crap. And so any company that relies on carbon offsets is already a red flag. But there are companies that have learned that lesson and are now trying to fix that problem. So two companies in the US, Stripe and Microsoft, are coming up with solutions in which they're looking at, okay, well, how can you verify that the carbon is actually being stored, and only then pay for that offset? So you look at those types of solutions. Take Google, for example. We talk about companies saying we have 100% renewables. Well, that might be true when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, but what happens at night? You're drawing power from a coal power plant, and then you'll just pay some credit, renewable energy credit, some premium price, and claim that you're 100% renewables. That's not quite right. So Google turned around and accepted that that's a problem. And now they're working towards making renewables be 24/7. So that's going to require matching supply with demand, or having some form of storage available for green electricity. So that's, I think, is the way. Again, my lens is always the solution. So you'll always find hundreds of problems, but what's the solution that others can learn from is the framing I use.
Thank you. That's helpful. Can I ask one quick question on that? I'm the one who asked the question.
Sure.
The understanding that, what you initially said, which is not a lot of PR people are helpful, and I've heard that before. How, from a solution-oriented mindset, can someone in my shoes, as there's more folks who are trying to truly have a solution-based mindset, think about it to be more helpful beyond, obviously looking at the journalist and making sure that you're helping them? Is there a way or a different lens to think about it that's truly helpful? Because I think the profession can be great, but it can also not be great, right? And so I'm trying to think about the great piece of it. Yeah. So is there anything that you can help climate comms people, if you want to call them that, think through that is truly going to use the profession in a good way? Well,
I think honesty is one I appreciate a lot, where when a solution is presented, or when an event has happened, or there's some initiative that's being taken, here are the honestly good things that we're doing, and here are the honest problems we have that we still need to tackle. Mm-hmm. That presents a much more balanced picture, because there is never a solution that doesn't come with problems that have not been addressed. That helps. Another thing that helps, and this is this is probably simple, but people who respond very quickly are immensely helpful, because we write stories at quick pace, and so if you can be the glue that makes the stories happen quickly, that is very, very appreciated. And typically that means you're connecting us to a relevant person at your firm, or the firm you're representing. But yeah.
Oh yeah, just tell us that it's going to be highly unlikely that you will get a response. So we advise you to go ahead and publish anyway. Those are sweet words, but yeah, good to get responses. I think one of the biggest counters to, again, like, this is a way, like, where of course the PR folks will do what you do, which is ordered, like, or design a sort of event, or, and some of those are extremely effective by the fact that they can capture public space. But I guess the fact is always going to be is that journalists or others who are looking into it will look at where companies' operations are, and will look at a previous track record. And of course, while there will be applause for taking steps forward, there has to be an acknowledgement of what is happening in company operations on ground and in different parts of the world, and how is that, whether that is being addressed, or whether there is an attempt to sort of redress some of those impacts, or have remedy for that. Those are things that should not be brushed under the carpet. And if it's and because those questions will come up and they will backfire, which will again get publicity, but not the kind that we like. So in that sense, like, prepare for and cover the ground and be honest and upfront on these things is a better way to design it than to design a something that's a proclamation, a distraction, or something that's actually a step forward. But yeah, I think actual acknowledge, like Akshat said, honesty is pretty great.
Great, thank you both. I just, as you were speaking there, I was just remembering a PR piece from an insurance and finance company in the UK called Aviva, which has, as it happens, Hold My Pension. And I was actually kind of remarkably impressed by their story, which kind of, you know, it went into where they'd not done well in the past, and it talked about how offsets are not the right solution for everything. And so I'll put it in the chat box here in case anyone wants to follow up, but it's quite interesting. So we've got just 7 minutes left, so I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more questions, and one that follows on quite nicely from the greenwashing topic just before. And this question came from Varsha, who was asking, has there been any instances so far of kind of the elite, the corporate space, the powerful, and those at the vulnerable end, those who are most vulnerable to climate, meeting at some midpoint and having some resolution that's beneficial to both parties? If anything comes to mind on that, that would be interesting to hear about.
I mean, it's such a rare event, and Aruna will probably back me up on this. I cannot think of very specific examples. I think one that is starting to happen is Unilever is probably one of those consumer companies that we all currently have a product sitting in our pocket or in our home that we don't know comes from Unilever because they have 20,000 brands. But Unilever has probably been the most climate friendly of the giant retailers. None of them are, doing the right thing, and they still have a long way to go. But one most recent thing that I worked on and working on is how Unilever is working with local communities to tackle deforestation, because deforestation is now becoming not just a environmental problem; it's also an investor problem. So companies that aren't addressing deforestation in their supply chain are losing investors. And so working with the communities there, and now I don't know if the C-suite has gone and met them, but I do know that Unilever's representatives have gone and met people in regions from where they secure basic supplies like palm oil or cocoa or corn or sugar. Yeah.
I've met in certain instances where it's happened, like at least they've come face to face, where again, like you might have the FFF activists at COP and being at a protest before Antonio Guterres sort of shows up and in front of all of the negotiators, keying into demands, I don't know in terms of reaching a sort of solution, but at least, yeah, those were debadged, were allowed back into the venue and so on. And it sort of has led to a situation where, again, that these are spaces and that at least here the climate vulnerable will at least be able to dialogue with the elite in that sense, or be able to do that. And I think now the elite are craving a lot more of that, to be able to put on, say that, okay, speak at this forum, be on that forum, for a set of climate young activists. But to resolve or move the needle, I definitely think that if it were not there, if the vulnerable were not at these big fora and meetings, or that civil society was not around, that a lot worse decisions would be passed. So it's that necessity to constantly keep that sort of pressure on. And I think that's moved the needle quite a bit on climate action. On a local ground phase, I think there's been, at least when I look at, for instance, huge mobilizations of workers, and of especially coal workers or villagers, and like you're talking about numbers in thousands, where you're actually able to force a sort of understanding with a company, let's say for instance Coal India, and being able to pressure and put a meeting. It is those sheer numbers, or the fact that production is being hit, or that workers are actually having to put bodies on the line, that is of course being supported to some extent by media and visibility, definitely is. But yeah, in those situations where at least there is a promise that's made to either hike wages, or reconsider or stall a policy, it is often a promise that is made temporarily, but and that's something that requires consistent community pressure. So yeah, sometimes it really is bodies on the line, resistance in numbers, that can sort of force that. Uh, but yeah, that and I think with investor pressure as well. So that's especially where media makes a difference, because I've had people who would, I mean, essentially of a bank putting greater pressure on a coal company to solve a rehabilitation and compensation issue than with anybody else, or even dialoguing or networking with the company itself. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much both. So just 2 minutes left, and I'm going to try and ask you one last quick question, which came from Ria in the chat a bit earlier, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit, but she was asking about, I guess, anyone else who might be in a position where they're seeing what you're doing and they like it and they want to do it too, or they want to try and make a transition towards climate-related journalism. What tips would you give, especially for people who maybe feel like they don't have the right background or the right qualifications, but they might still want to try and get there? And how easy would it be, for example, to transition into a climate-related journalist career?
I mean, my journey is probably, one in ways in which I didn't train in journalism and got into it was through internship. So I used to write as a hobby, and I used to blog. So I had a lot of my writing out there already. And then I was able to use that writing to write for publications, to send it to editors and say, look, this is what I've written about. Would you, I have this story idea. Would you like me to write it for your publication? And then through doing that a few times, I got into an internship with The Economist. And once you're inside a news organization, then you have the ability to, you have a portfolio. You can create a set of clips that you can send to other editors and get hired. But yeah, I would say start writing, as soon as you can, and start publishing, not just writing for yourself. Getting feedback from people, people who would read your stuff, from colleagues, friends, family, and then start pitching to publications. I would say that, as Aruna warned, it's a tough beat. Journalism is not, I feel very privileged to be able to work where I work and have people who back me up for hard stories, and have lawyers reach through my stories to make sure that, if we are sued, that there will be people who would take care of it. But those positions are few, and getting to a staff job is a very hard grind, and you'd need to be ready to put that grind in. And if not, as Aruna said, a lot of people then have to get second jobs, and it's a hard career. So if you make that choice, make that with open eyes, and talk to as many journalists as you can when you're making the move.
Yeah, it's an endangered profession. So, I mean, to most young journalists and others starting off, we don't necessarily want to. Then the good side is, of course, that you have new outlets or new mediums every day, whether it's uh, pandemic podcasts, or whether it is Insta lives as a way to sort of report on an issue. There is a lot more at the confluence of social media, technology, and otherwise, where you could actually do something that's completely out there in you versus something that legacy folks will not be doing. I would advise you to have at least 3 or 4 months of rent saved at one level. And of course, go and join groups where you have lists of editors and where to pitch if you're doing this as a freelancer. But my main piece of advice in that way is what has worked for me, and what I think there will always be a need for is to go and see for yourself. Go to places where and be mindful, be respectful, acknowledge that you either parachuting into a place or there is an outsider, learn as much, speak to as many people as you can. And of course, try and pitch it right. But more importantly, yeah, just to go and see for yourself, verify it with whatever else that's either in the greenwashing or in company documents be of use. Take documents or things and share it with the community, so that if that is at least one way of doing personal service, which is aside from just the journalism part of it. But yeah, tell a personal story and a true story. And yeah, I think, follow your own intuition and some of your most far out conspiracy theories. And it's 2021, they might actually be right and correct for all you know. So yeah, I mean, that is a bit of an investigative instinct to hone. But yeah, I think to tell a human story, go and see for yourself, and trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to ask for help, because there's a really wide community. But also, yeah, know your audience and who you want to tell the story to, and where you want to write. And that's a good way to sort of explore.
Yeah, and I would echo Aruna there. Like, among climate journalists, I have not found competition. It's collaboration. Be that person who's at a rival publication, I've never found anybody not willing to talk. I think, as Aruna said, it's an endangered species. Being a journalist covering the environment, we all want every other journalist to succeed, and so we make time, and other journalists have made time, and so don't be afraid about getting in touch and ask questions.
Brilliant. That's a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Akshat and Aruna. Really, really grateful for having you here for the session today. And thanks as well, everyone, for your questions. And sorry we didn't get through them all. There were lots of good ones in the chat there. But Akshat and Aruna, if anyone's interested in asking you more, are you happy to receive emails and things? Feel free to say no, if not.
Yes.
No problem.
DMs on Twitter, because in case anything gets lost in some sort of email trail. But it was so lovely
I'm good with email.
Yeah, he's better with email.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening, and it was so great to speak to you. And
thank you. Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.